Hello and welcome to DW News Desk.
I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting.
And I'm Amian Isif. Today we're going to be talking about Europe's efforts to stop the Russian Shadow Fleet. That is a fleet of Russian tankers that are designed to bust Western sanctions. They're old, often uninsured, and they sail through the Baltic, exploiting loopholes and gray areas in international law and in sanctions in order to bring Russian crude to world markets. That's what we're going to be talking about. The European Union and the UK have just recently announced a new raft of sanctions that are designed specifically to target these Russian tankers and to close those loopholes essentially by sanctioning the Russian tankers. That's one way that they're trying to deal with it. Another way that they're trying to stop and choke off basically this point where Russia is getting its oil out into the world through European waters is a lot more dramatic. And Alex, you have a video of that for us.
Yeah, I do. I'm just going to talk it through with you before I play it because it was filmed last week. It shows the Estonian military trying to stop an oil tanker called Jaguar from sailing through a part of the Baltic Sea in between Estonia and Finland. It was apparently sailing without a flag. Certainly that's what Estonia was saying at that point, and that is against maritime rules. The video of the incident is filmed from the ship's bridge by the crew. Now, it was originally picked up by a Russian journalist, but then it was verified and then released by the news agency Reuters, and that is why we are going to show it to you now. I'm going to play it. As I play it, I will be pausing it just to make sure it's clear what's happening, because it's quite quick. But we just start here, where you will hear a Russian on that tanker. We believe the Russian is the captain of the ship, and that's the first voice that we hear.
65 miles.
Требует бросить якорь.
And just to confirm that what he's talking about there is this helicopter. He says that we're being met with helicopters who are demanding us to drop anchor. And we can assume that these helicopters, and this one in particular, is Estonian. And I'll keep playing the video.
Требует бросить якорь.
This is Estonian warship Papa 6732. Your request will be denied. Follow my instructions. Alter your course to 105 immediately. Over.
So that is the radio there. We're hearing in English somebody's telling the tanker that they are denied passage and that they must alter course. So we again assume that that is the Estonian, an Estonian there telling them that that ship is not allowed to pass further.
Yes.
Yes. MiG.
Now, that there is a fighter jet, and we believe it is a Russian fighter jet. In fact, Reuters says it appears to be a Russian Sukhoi jet. So that is important in this video.
MiG.
वो हमारे just ऊपर अभी सामने से हमारे ऊपर आ रहा है.
And then we hear another member of the crew speaking in Hindi who is talking about the plane is on top of us. It's either an aircraft or a drone. So there appears to be more than just a helicopter and a jet in the sky, but this plane or drone as well.
Aircraft है. हाँ, drone जैसा ही है ये.
And then here we are seeing a military boat, and we again know that this is Estonian. We know actually what happened is that the Estonians stood down and the ship was able to pass through the Baltic Sea and on to Russia. So despite the Estonian military being involved, telling that ship it couldn't pass, the ship did pass and it did end up in Russian waters.
So this happened last week. The news broke a few days later. And the reason a lot of people are talking about this video is that it, first of all, represents an escalation in terms of the fact that Russia pulled out one of its fighter jets to essentially escort this plane to scare off the Estonians so that the so-called shadow ship could get back to Russia. That's one reason. The second reason is because it's the first time that Russia has actually essentially claimed ownership of this shadow fleet. The point of the shadow fleet is that they're not flying a Russian flag. Everyone knows that they are operated by Russia, that they're taking Russian oil out through the Baltic Sea, but until now, Russia hasn't actually stepped in to protect these ships, essentially claiming ownership of it. So that's a significant development in this story. Europe just yesterday announced a new raft of sanctions, which had been in planning for a while. It wasn't associated with this incident, but Europe is essentially trying to choke off this shipping route with sanctions. So not just putting pressure on the ships through coast guards, through patrolling the European waters, but also sanctions. We'll be looking, and just bear with me, because I know when I hear the word sanctions, sometimes start to get a little bit sleepy. But I promise you,
especially when we're on the 17th round of sanctions.
Exactly. Yeah. This is the 17th. Just the number 17 makes me sleepy. But I promise you want to stick around for the end of the show, because we're not just talking about the bureaucracy of sanctions. We're talking about the fact that this is the 17th round. So far, it's appeared to make the shadow fleet grow. Russia is exporting vast amounts of oil, despite the fact that Europe has been struggling with sanctions to try to cut that off. Still happening. We're going to talk about why. We're also going to be talking about some unintended consequences. The fact that sanctions have at some points pushed up the price of oil, making it even more attractive to foreign buyers. We're going to be talking about the fact that India, which is an ally of Western countries, is buying the bulk of this oil that's coming through on the shadow fleet. And we're going to be talking about the fact that once it ends up in India and some other countries, and it is then refined, comes back to Europe. So some critics have actually looked at Europe and said, the sanctions are not designed to stop Russian oil exports, but are designed to try to target Russia, but without cutting Europe off of Russian oil. So that's what we're going to be talking about when we talk about sanctions, not just we're not just going to be reading the documents.
And certainly that's why Europe has been accused of hypocrisy in all of this. Anyway, to help us with that discussion, we've got two great guests. First of all, let me introduce you to Arthur Sullivan, who's at the end of the table. He is a DW business reporter, works with the business department here at Deutsche Welle, and has been covering the Russian shadow fleet for some time, as well as sanctions. And you've done a lot of work and videos and written pieces about that. So thank you very much for being with us. And a little bit later, not long to go, but we will have an old friend of News Desk joining us, and that is Terry Schultz. She is actually going to be joining us from NATO headquarters in Brussels. So she will have the very latest from there. And of course, we have Dustin Hemmerlein, a favourite of News Desk, integral to what we do, I would say, Dustin.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah.
And you will be, I'm saying that particularly because you'll be helping me in particular.
Yes,
You're
exactly.
monitoring the chat, and you will be making sure that people are keeping it nice and friendly in the chat. But you've already seen some interesting comments.
Exactly, and we'll also, I'm not only going to make sure that you guys are nice and friendly, I'm also going to forward your comments to everyone here at the desk. So if you have a question, let me know, and we'll get it to our experts, to our reporters, and they can answer it. I've already seen two comments that I want to highlight on a community post. Chilo is asking, you mean what happens when steel oil meets environmental disaster? Apparently, it's only a matter of time. And Corinel said, shadow fleet just means not insured in London. I thought that was a very good definition for shadow fleet. And yeah, so like keep your comments coming. We are definitely interested to read them and to put them to everyone here on the show. And we also have a poll question for you guys, which I want to read now. It's, can Europe's efforts stop the shadow fleet? The EU is, answer possibility one is the EU finally is playing hardball. Possibility two is, yes, but sanctions won't be enough. Number three, no, the EU is all talk. And number four, no, countries will buy cheap oil. Yeah, you will find this question pinned to the top of the chat. So feel free to answer, feel free to come to us on the chat, and we are excited for it.
All right, thanks, Dustin. Yeah, please do that poll. It's always good to have a lot of numbers on there so we get a clear idea of what people already think. Obviously, you're going to be learning more about the topic as the show progresses, but it would be great if everybody who's in the chat could vote on that. I do want to get to that definition of a shadow fleet, and that's why I will bring you in. What is exactly a shadow fleet? This is a term that's been around for a while, but what exactly does it mean here in this context?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here on News Desk with you all. But yeah, I think to really get into what the shadow fleet is, you have to first of all really think about why it's there and why it's there in the first place, and it's there because of the war. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine over 3 years ago now. So in the immediate aftermath of that, the Western Alliance, the G7, the EU, the US came together, and obviously we're trying to figure out, as you've already mentioned, sanctions. What would be the most effective sanctions to try and deal with Russian aggression in Ukraine and to try and perhaps bring them to the negotiating table? And it took them quite a while to sort of reach consensus on this. It was actually December 2022 when they first of all agreed that they would themselves not buy Russian oil. Russian gas Europe was too dependent on that. So that still actually comes into Europe in other forms, not necessarily pipeline. But the Russian oil they did put an embargo on. But they didn't want to disrupt global markets by saying, well, we're going to just embargo all Russian oil. We're going to stop countries buying it full stop. They were really worried about disruptions to prices. Obviously, this was in the aftermath of the pandemic. Inflation was rampant around the world. And so they were really determined to come up with an intervention which would avoid cutting off Russian oil altogether. Because, for example, when Iranian oil or Venezuelan oil was sanctioned previously, it was just sanctioned full stop. You were trying to hide the fact that you had that at all. Russian oil...
What does that mean when it's fully sanctioned? That means that the U.S. doesn't allow anybody who's buying
is in trouble with the U.S., basically.
They can't use banks.
Yeah, they may have their dollars frozen. The U.S. dollar is so important to a lot of these companies dealing in the trade of oil or other maritime trade. And if the U.S. sanctions them, like they would have in the case of Iranian or Venezuelan, they've got serious problems. They didn't want to do that with Russian oil because Russian oil represented such a huge chunk of global oil markets. So they come up with this very unusual intervention called the oil price cap.
Okay.
Which was, I mean, the comment I thought was funny about the shadow fleet is any ships that are not insured in London. That's sort of true. But the thing is, there's a reason why ships are insured through London. Conventional insurance for shipping companies became extremely expensive for ordinary insurers. And so insurance for maritime shipping ended up being organised by the ship companies and the shippers themselves through London. It ended up covering almost 95% of all maritime insurance. So what the Western powers decided was, you can sell Russian oil, but you will not be able to use these services of logistics or critically insurance unless the oil is sold at a certain price, $60 a barrel, at or below that price. So the target was not to stop Russian oil, the target was to limit the revenues they could get from it, that Moscow could get. You can still sell your oil, but you're not going to make as much money as you'd like to. But Russia, of course, wanted to maximise its revenues. And the way, it took me a while to get there, but this is where the shadow fleet comes in.
Maximize, especially because the price shot up after the war in Ukraine started.
It dramatically shot up because obviously there was a huge fear over supply. They thought there would be other disruptions, and it was still as well in the aftermath of the pandemic. So the price was already quite high as countries were emerging from that. So they set about, Russia said about, right, how can we continue to get our oil around the world and avoid this? There's a few different options they had, but the one that they had sort of identified through Iran and Venezuela's experience was this shadow fleet. So what they do is they go into the used tanker market. Now, the lifespan of one of these oil tankers is typically up to 20 years. But by the time it gets to that stage, it's really not seaworthy anymore. It certainly should be very close to the end of its shipping life. It's got a lot of hull damage, etc. The maintenance costs go up. So Russia started buying up these tankers. Now, at first, they were able to get them for relatively cheap by their standards, 20 million. But then they started spending 30, 40 million per tanker because their own demand for them was driving it up. So it started to cost them a lot of money. But it helped them to get their oil around the world. So the way these shadow fleet tankers would work, you mentioned the flag states. So ships have to have a flag of designation. And then there's certain flags of convenience. So it's a Russian ship, but the flag could be somewhere from West Africa. It could be somewhere from the Pacific island.
In this case, the Gabon.
Gabon.
Gabon, exactly.
Well, Gabon, until then, according to Estonia, there was no flag on this ship. That's what we...
Apparently took
Right,
it
it may
down.
not even have one. So it's just a flag of convenience. It's not actually in any way connected to this country. The insurance is perhaps the most opaque of all because we know it doesn't have Western insurance. And we know that Western insurance was by far, like Western London, this group I talked about of sort of the shipping industry's own insurance services, we know that covered the vast majority of shipping. And essentially, if you weren't covered by that, then there's question marks about where the insurance is coming from. But they started getting these ships, these old tankers, and sending them around the world, selling the oil on them or shipping it with them, but not using the Western services and therefore not having to sell it on the terms of the price cap. So what happened then was you had China and India in particular, dramatically ramping up its purchases because, first of all, they identified, well, we can start buying this oil really cheaply. even before the price cap came in, because it was Russian oil naturally was going to be sold at a discount because it did become more unattractive to, a refiner, for example, in India is not going to buy Russian oil for the same price as they could get oil that's untainted, so to speak. So they're already getting a discount. But then the shadow fleet oil, they don't have qualms about necessarily buying it. So that's ultimately what the shadow fleet is. And it's
not, what you're saying is it's absolutely not illegal to do that. It's perfectly fine. You just do it not going through this London system.
It's a really grey area because we don't know about the insurance. The insurance on these shadow fleets, in many cases, would be illegal because they probably don't have legitimate insurance when you actually look into it. For example, if an oil spill happens or an accident happens, I wouldn't be at all confident that some of the insurance structures that are apparently affiliated to these shadow fleet ships are actually going to pay out in the event of a potentially multi-billion-dollar oil spill. I would say not a hope, actually, in most of the cases. But thankfully, to date, we haven't had one of those incidents for sure to know. But when you're going through these very opaque systems, I mean, if I could just divert for just one moment, I think sometimes when we're talking about these topics, it can be quite grand and hard to sort of imagine it, how it works on an individual basis. But there was a case a couple of weeks ago in the UK of a UK citizen, I think his name was John Ormerod, who was sanctioned by the UK for his role in the shadow fleet, which was very, very unusual because he's a UK citizen, been sanctioned. And what he had done was, or what he's accused of doing, and the Financial Times did an exhaustive investigation which showed this, he had set up holding companies, I think around 25 holding companies in the Marshall Islands, which if you want to show your viewers on the map, they're a tiny set of islands way, way out in the Pacific. The companies were affiliated to the Marshall Islands, but the evidence showed that it was Lukoil, the Russian state oil company, was giving the money to these entities to buy the ships, and that was essentially them building up their shadow fleet. So it's as simple as that, really. Buying them through very unusual practices, through countries that maybe you haven't heard of, using insurance companies that maybe don't really exist.
Could you pull up the
I'll
map?
just say that Orange Cat says, best explanation ever, great job. And I have to say that was a very good explanation, so thank you. Of where it
Baltic,
happened.
Yeah, just
sure.
the Baltic, because I just want to get people on the same page about where this is happening. I think that's really important.
OK, let me just come out a bit of this map, just to show where we are.
That's where the particular incident happened.
OK, so hang on. So this is Scandinavia, this here is Finland, and down here is Estonia. So I'm just zooming in.
Right.
If I come out of my
If you scroll
screen,
up just a little bit more, then we can see where Russia is.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So let me just come out. And here, look, there's St. Petersburg. So it was somewhere, we know, around this particular Estonian island that this ship, this tanker was, heading this way towards Russia. And this is where, let me just pull it over again.
So it was coming back to basically pick up oil and then take off
to here.
Again.
And this is where it happened. And it ended up being able to, as I said, have a free passage into Russian waters, which are here. Okay.
And so basically, just to be clear, the shadow fleet will leave a Russian port, go through these narrow waters, which are in the economic zone of EU and NATO countries. And why can't they do anything about it?
Well, under what auspices would they stop it? So, for example, if the ship is sailing and they don't actually know, first of all, is it a shadow fleet tanker? So how will they know that it's a tanker? Now, we can get into the fact that they have been gradually, it took them quite a while, but sanctioning shadow fleet tankers. But the ship may be, in their eyes, legally sailing. It may be, they don't know, for example, if it's selling oil. They don't know if it's got oil on board. They don't even know where the origin of that oil is. So, and as well, what authority would be stopping it? So, for example, it could be, like in this example, it was the Estonian Navy. But I think the auspices, I mean, I may be wrong on this, but I think the auspices under which they were conducting that search or perhaps that investigation was based on patrols to do with fear of sabotage attacks on critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, not necessarily to stop ships carrying Russian oil. Okay. So I think there's a question mark over. I mean, one of the issues with the sanctions since the word go, that any expert on this will tell you, if you speak to them, I've spoken to quite a few over the last few years, is compliance and like enforcement. So to what extent are those countries like the US, the EU, that are putting the sanctions down, how much are they following up on the actual compliance with sanctions or indeed enforcement of their existing rules? And I think a lot of people would say not sufficiently at all, that there's been a real lack of enforcement. And often the problem is because who does the enforcing? Would it be NATO? Would it be the territorial waters? For example, one of the proposals was, I don't know, a few rounds of sanctions back. I know you mentioned they're on round 17, which sort of tells its own story of how complicated the sanctions picture gets. But one of the proposals was that Denmark, because if you look again at that map,
Yeah.
you can see that any ships that are coming out of the Russian ports in the Baltic Sea have to go through Danish territorial waters before they get out into the wider world. So one of the proposals was that Denmark would be checking ships to check their environmental compliance. So as I mentioned, a lot of these are very old tankers that may not be up to speed with environmental maritime standards. So it's not that you're stopping them to go, hey, is that illegal Russian oil you've got? No, you're checking them to see if they're compliant with safety standards. But they didn't actually do that in the end. They didn't actually bring that into the sanctions.
Let's bring in Terry Schultz, DW correspondent in Brussels. She's at the NATO headquarters right now. She can answer a lot of these questions because she was actually in Estonia when the news broke of this incident happening. First of all, hello, Terry, and thanks for joining us on News Desk once again.
Guys.
Good to have you
News
here.
Desk. Yes.
And first of all, I just want to play this interview, part of an interview that you did with Hanno Pevkur. He is the Estonia's defense minister. So you just talked to him, and I want to play a clip of that.
Right.
Interestingly enough, during Exercise Hedgehog, Russia still sent a fighter jet into Estonian airspace, NATO airspace, as Estonia was attempting to escort one of these shadow tankers out of your territorial waters. This shows that Russia certainly hasn't taken its eye off the ball up here in the north as well. Do you think this signals, since it was the first time it happened, does this signal that Russia is willing to escalate its protection of these ships that are earning it billions upon billions of euros, of dollars in illegal oil transports?
Well, first of all, we did escort the vessel to the Russian border and to the Russian waters. But what is important in this case is that first time ever Russia as a state basically declared that they are taking the responsibility over the shadow fleet, because this vessel, Jaguar, was sailing under the flag of Gabon. And then approaching our waters, it was removed at all. So it didn't have a flag at all at this very moment. So basically Russia was saying that they are defending and protecting the ship or the vessel without any flag. Basically what they did, officially Russia said that, yes, we are behind of the shadow fleet.
So Terry, tell me in your view why last week's incident was such a big deal.
You heard Defense Minister Pevkur say this is the first time that Russia has actually claimed responsibility for these shadow tankers by sending its fighter jet there, trying to make sure that the tanker got out of Estonia's territorial waters and made it on its way to the Russian port. But, you know, I've done a lot of reporting on this over the last couple of years, and this is really just the latest incident. As we've been talking about, these ships not only skirt the sanctions on the oil price cap, but they also have been found responsible for the destruction of critical undersea infrastructure multiple times. I mean, you saw that dramatic case in December where the Finns boarded a ship for the first time to stop it on its way to cut a second batch of cables after having already cut some between Finland and Estonia. And as has also been mentioned, there are real environmental risks here. I mean, these ships are decrepit. They're so decrepit that once they're detained, they're not even allowed to continue sailing because they're found to be so unseaworthy that Finland and Estonia have been afraid to let them sail on. So there are just so many problems connected with these ships. You know, the oil price cap is one, but the environmental risks are another. And just to note that in this 17th round of sanctions, the ship that you see here, the one that was just detained by Estonia or attempted to be detained by Estonia, is on the list. So it is now one of the banned shadow tankers itself.
You just heard Arthur talking about how difficult it is, though, by maritime law when you're sailing through these waters, even though they're just a couple of kilometers, even like a few hundred meters off the coast of the EU. And the EU suspects that they're doing very illegal stuff, sailing on tankers that could cause environmental disasters in the waters not close to Russia, but close to Denmark, for example, a disaster that would affect Denmark. But Denmark, Estonia, they have difficulty in actually policing these waters because that's just the nature of maritime law. Can you tell us specifically in this incident where the Estonian Navy went out and escorted this Russian tanker. What was their justification for doing that?
Well, let me just clarify a couple of things. They don't have trouble policing these waters. They're policing them all the time. And NATO has now instituted a new operation, Baltic Sentry, as of January, to even add more patrols, to add NATO patrols to the national, patrols that were already going on in these waters. And the Finns found, in the case where they boarded a ship for the first time, they found what they believe is an exemption in maritime law that allows you to board a ship if there's a national security risk. And clearly a lot can fall under, national security risk, not only a ship that could be dragging an anchor as in some of these cases, but also an environmental, potential for environmental disaster. And in this case, with the last case in Estonia, it hid its flag. It dropped a flag. It was sailing without a flag. That's against maritime law. So that one was pretty clear cut. As you mentioned, once the jet came in, this ship was allowed to sail on. It was escorted out by Estonia's own choice, but you're not allowed to sail without a flag. So, there are a lot more questions, as you've been discussing. They're not allowed to sail without insurance either. But until recently, it's been thought that you can't board a ship just to look at its insurance. That's changing also. If it's illegal to sail without insurance, you should be allowed to check. And I would say these states are getting more bold, the Danes, the Finns, the Swedes, the Estonians, about stopping these ships and boarding them and saying, show us your papers.
Okay, and then there's maritime law, there's international law, and then there's the way things actually play out on the international stage. Russia has proven time and time again that they're more interested in their national security, their own interests, than they are in international law. I mean, the invasion of Ukraine was a flagrant violation of international law, and yet they still justify it. So in this scenario, did Estonia actually lose here? I mean, Russia showed that they're willing to go even further, flying a jet through Estonia's airspace, maybe scare them off a little bit. Is that the way that it's being spun, at least by Russia?
Estonia didn't, I mean, you saw, I spoke with the defense minister. He didn't give me any impression as to whether they think it was a win or a loss. I mean, not having a tanker that could have an oil leak at any moment next to your shore is probably not a loss when you get rid of it. But I don't think that they were intimidated by this Russian fighter jet so much. This happens all the time. People may not be aware that NATO scrambles jets multiple times per week, because Russian fighter jets intrude on its airspace or come very close to the border, flying in international airspace. So it's no longer any significant event that NATO jets fly up and escort Russian fighter jets out of their airspace. The significance, as the Estonians described it now, is that this is the first time that Russia has done this with specific connection to one of these shadow tankers. So that was they're reading more into, I think, the symbolism of this than any danger, because the fighter jets are there all the time. NATO polices Baltic airspace 24/7 just for this reason.
Yeah, I can see why that's not something people think about all the time. Maybe they don't want to think about the fact that NATO jets are flying around trying to intimidate Russia, and Russia is intimidating NATO. Yeah, that's a scary thought. Maybe it's time to check in on
I mean, we've had a lot
now.
of questions and comments in the chat, a lot about sanctions, which I think we want to talk about in not quite at this moment.
Yeah, right,
So we're not ignoring you about sanctions. I promise that we will talk about that. But one question that does come up a few times is, and I don't know whether you're happy to talk about this now, but for example, Nile Chaturvedi is saying, along with others, why don't European countries stop buying tainted oil and gas from Russia? And maybe that's something we will come back to when we look more about what's happening with other countries' roles, such as India, where Arthur was saying before, where it's being refined. So I want to make sure that we are 100% not ignoring the questions that you are putting in the chat. Very important questions. But that's basically what people are asking at the moment. Why is Europe still buying it? And lots of questions about sanctions as well.
Can you maybe read off one of the questions about sanctions? Because I want to get to that now.
Okay.
I think it's a good time to do that.
Great. So we have what what are the laws that can be used to control Russian vessels and trade routes in international waters? So that kind of links to sanctions when we're talking about the shadow fleet, but specifically, are there any actual laws that can be invoked to control that trade and those vessels? Maybe I can ask you after that.
Well, the thing is with the sanctions are not necessarily international laws. They're sanctions put down by certain countries relating to economic penalties that they will leverage against entities they see to be violating whatever rule they've decreed. So, for example, in the case of the Shadow Fleet, since I think it was October 2023, the Biden administration came up with the idea of sanctioning individual tankers. So before this, the sanctions had focused on banks, Russian banks, they'd focused on individuals, but then they thought, let's start sanctioning the tankers and see if this will deter ports or refiners in India or China or elsewhere from actually accepting what are called designated tankers. And it worked. It has been very effective. It has actually arguably been the most effective sanction that they've had yet. And the US did it, but then they actually stopped in the lead up to the election. I think for fear of perhaps destabilising energy markets. That's just a supposition, but that was the view. But the EU and the UK ramped up their own designation of tankers. There was obviously some crossover. They were designating the same tankers that the US had done. But just in the last few days, they've now added a whole new range of tankers individually. Now, what this means in practice, it sort of effectively answers that question, is that refiners or ports in certain countries are not willing to accept designated tankers because they're afraid of then facing sanctions from particularly the US. Now, the thing about sanctions is sanctions are really only as effective as your view as a person involved as to how likely the country levelling the sanction is going to act on it. And in that sense, the US is vital because the dollar is so central to so many of these international transactions that a refiner in India or a trader or a logistics trader who deals in international transport of oil would have a genuine fear that if we accept this ship, the US may freeze our account.
So we've talked then about sanctions, and we were talking specifically about the EU, but what are the US sanctions then in place on all this?
Well, the US sanctions, they had started the process of sanctioning these individual tankers. So that was a really big step by the Biden administration. Actually, one of the last things that Biden did before he left office in January was they had a whole new list of tankers that were sanctioned.
But is that still the case now?
They're still sanctioned, but Trump has not added any new ones.
Okay.
So there's a sense that the steam is sort of running out a little bit of that movement. Now, that's the reason the UK and the EU have continued to step it up. Because it's important to say here, this has been working. So the thing is, Russia will sell oil regardless, but Russia has still got a mainstream fleet. It's not just a shadow fleet. It has also hundreds and hundreds of ships which are legally selling its oil. They may be Greek-owned, they may be Turkish-owned. The difference is they have to sell it compliant with the oil price cap. Now, the interesting thing is the price of oil now at the moment is actually close to the level of the cap. I think I just checked today before the show. The price of Brent crude is around $66 a barrel. I'm sure it's fluctuated since I last saw it. But the oil price cap, as we mentioned, is $60. So that's why the EU actually at the minute wants to lower the price cap. And this is what experts have been calling for years. They said from the start, it's too high. $60 is too high. So that's the thing, is that there are other ways Russia can legally sell its oil, but the sanctions primarily try and target the tankers of the shadow fleet. And actually it's worked. There's a guy in Harvard University, Craig Kennedy, he's done great work on this. I recommend anyone who's really interested in this topic, go and look at his Substack on the shadow fleet. But he has shown the data over the last few months that if you take two lines of sort of, this is the shadow fleet, the amount of oil revenues Russia's getting from its shadow fleet, that line's been going down, whereas the mainstream fleet has been now surpassing it. So they're actually selling more oil from the mainstream fleet, which is one of the reasons why, for example, if you look at India as a country, India continues to import massive amounts of Russian oil, but the price is lower for Russia. So they're selling a lot of oil, they're getting less for it.
Can we have a...
Okay, I just very quickly just want to say this from Antonia VW, talking about sanctions. The EU should actually sanction Spain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, etc. We are importing billions in natural gas, it's saying gas, but of course we're talking also about oil, from Russia. Sorry, but the EU is pathetic. And that is a point that's coming out.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
That's actually a very interesting point. That's to do with this topic of LNG, liquefied natural gas. So the EU never issued a ban. It did issue an embargo on Russian oil. It never issued an embargo on gas because of dependence on it. And while pipelines, for example, those going through Ukraine no longer carry gas to Europe, LNG, so that's this super chilled gas which is carried by ship and is then transferred at a port. The EU has been increasing its imports of Russian LNG, and countries that those mentioned, they've been receiving large quantities of it. And in fact, they've even been sometimes receiving the quantities of it and just processing it at the port and then sending it out to the rest of the world. So just literally companies in those ports making money for the reprocessing of Russian LNG. The EU has tried to clamp down on that specific aspect of it, but it is a valid point that the EU has never actually dealt with its Russian gas problem fully legally. It has dramatically reduced the amount, but it's still, we're still using Russian gas in the EU.
So that's gas.
Yeah.
I want to turn back to oil just because that is where we're really getting into the conflict in the Baltic Sea, and this is definitely not a defense of Europe. But let's take a look at what percentage is going where. So this is, we have a graph for you that shows the percentage of oil, crude oil, that's coming through this shadow tanker fleet. Not all of the oil, but just the shadow tankers. So we have India is by far the top buyer with 58%, well over half. The second place is China with 15%, and all the other countries in the world make up 27%. So in some ways, you could say that it's the Baltic Sea is the pipeline, metaphorical pipeline between Russia and India. And we were just talking about the fact that India is doing this completely above the water. I mean, they don't want to get in trouble with sanctions. They don't want to get in trouble with the U.S. and Europe, major trading partners, close allies. What happens when one of these Russian shadow tankers reaches India? Is there ever a problem there? Do they check its license? Do you know anything about this?
Well, I think the thing is India and the Indian government would say they're not allies of Europe or the US. They're partners.
Yeah.
They're proudly non-aligned.
No, yeah.
So I think that's a
I
very
knew that when I said it. I was like, wait,
it's a very important distinction, I think, with India. And I think from the start of this whole war, people probably thought, oh well, India will come good. You know, people on the Western side, India will do what we'd like them to do with regard to Russian oil. But that's not how they see it. They see this as oil they can legally purchase for much cheaper than they perhaps ordinarily could get it, and that they can then use it for their population of 1.4 billion people, which has dramatic energy needs. And obviously they want their energy to be as cheap as possible for their own population.
Yeah.
So that's obviously how they view it. Now, in terms of your specific question about how they can deal with sort of the sanctions question, Indian refiners and ports have been very reluctant to accept sanctioned shadow fleet vessels, particularly from the US. Now, India doesn't necessarily follow EU or UK sanctions. They don't necessarily say, well, OK, we're not going to do it because you sanctioned it. They do tend to follow US sanctions because of what I said about fear of dollar accounts being frozen, and perhaps the US does have a singular... I mean, the US has a very strong reputation also for following up on its sanctions. It puts the sanctions down, it monitors how countries and individuals are complying, and if they feel that they're not, they will hit them. But India, I think, to that extent, has been reluctant to accept US sanctioned vessels. However, because, as I mentioned, the Trump administration has not been adding new designations to the shadow fleet, then India has been, I guess, somewhat emboldened by that, because in February, for example, that was a month after the Biden administration put in a lot of sanctions, Indian imports went down quite dramatically of Russian oil. But they've been gradually increasing again, but predominantly through, as I mentioned, that mainstream fleet. A lot of them have been coming on legal Russian ships.
I just want to put a question to Terry, which has come from Arpad in the chat. Terry, Arpad is asking, why did the EU only sanction 200 out of roughly 600 ships?
Yeah. I mean, they're working on it. They're increasing the number in each sanctions package of how many ships they put on the list, because there's a legal process. You can't just come up with a ship, you know, that doesn't look seaworthy, so let's put it on the list. There's a legal process they have to use with sanctions. And then in sanctions in particular, all member states have to agree to this. So it takes quite a while to get individuals or companies or ships on a sanctions list. But if I could, I'd just like to go back to a couple of things that have been said before. I don't know if India should be let off so easily, because it knowingly reprocesses this oil that is coming on these tankers. But Europe, above all, then buys this oil. When I was in Denmark reporting on this, some Danes told me that, you know, ships that are known to be shadow tankers sail through the Danish Straits to Russia. Oh, they're bad. Then they reprocess the oil in India, and Denmark buys it back, knowing it came, you know, it's the same ship. It's the same ship reprocessed in India. It's no longer Russian oil or reprocessed, elsewhere. It's not Russian oil anymore. So Europe does have, does need to answer for some of this. But I would also like to point out that there is, in fact, legislation coming that does cut off the Russian sources of energy, LNG and oil, gas and nuclear. By the end of 2027, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, says that the EU will be free of all Russian energy sources. And by the end of this year, 2025, member states have to submit their plans to the Commission on how they're going to cease using all of the Russian energy that they use in any form by 2027. So there are plans in place. They're not effective at the moment, but certainly the EU is trying to wean itself off all Russian energy sources. Also, just one more fact, and I reported on the sanctions package yesterday, so it's right at the top of my mind that, in fact, EU imports of Russian LNG did go up last year. But at the same time, there is this rule that they have to be completely cut off by 2027.
So you're talking about this effort in Brussels to create a system where they can really crack down on this shadow tanker fleet without doing too much damage to their own economies. I want to bring in a clip from an interview DW did with Bill Browder. He's a financier, and he's also a, I think in English you say financier, sorry. He's also an activist against Putin's Russia, essentially. And here's what he told us.
Well, so far the sanctions, both by the EU, US, UK, are all incremental. There's every little bit hurts the Russians. The overall sanctions package definitely hurts the Russians. But there's one huge loophole. And that loophole is that Russia can continue to export oil. They can export oil, and they make hundreds of billions of dollars a year exporting oil. And they use that hundreds of billions of dollars to pay for weapons to kill Ukrainians. And until we do something definitive, where we say no more exporting of oil, or maybe sanctioning the buyers of the oil to say no more buying of the Russian oil, Russia will continue to fight this war. And so that's the elephant in the room. That's what has to be fixed.
Terry, is this actually on the table in Brussels? Are people talking about this, or is the mood there basically like, yeah, we know what would work the best, but we're not going to do it because that'd be crazy?
Well, I think we all need to continue to point it out, as Bill Browder does, and as I'm doing now, that what good are all these other measures you're taking to help Ukraine and to try to take money out of Russia's pocket when last year you actually paid more for Russian oil imports than the entire bloc together than the EU itself sent Ukraine for assistance. So that doesn't make any sense. And when you put those numbers in front of people, it should make them blanch a bit. And like I said, there are measures in place to wean the entire bloc off of Russian energy sources for more reasons than just Ukraine. But at the moment, let's say primarily Ukraine. But that's still another couple of years if it even goes through. If countries do follow the requirements that have been put in place by 2027. And Bill Browder's absolutely right. It doesn't make any sense to be taking all of these measures, putting these ships on a list if you're going to continue buying the oil that they're transporting. There's a lot of charade here, and I think we should all be pointing it out as often as possible.
And that's something that Black Canadian 93 says. If Europe is going to re-import oil from, and he says, India, then what is the point of sanctions? And one other question, DeVos says, how much have sanctions really slowed down Russia? And that's a question that many people have been asking over the past 3 years, haven't they?
Yes.
And maybe
and there are signs that it has slowed. Sorry, we just had a new report out last week prepared by the Swedish government that says that Russian sanctions are biting more than it appears, and that part of their disinformation and their propaganda is to try to indicate that they're doing fine. But the truth is that circumvention of sanctions, illegally circumventing sanctions, as well as this huge loophole with buying Russian energy. Yeah, I can see how some people who are working to help Ukraine could feel quite frustrated and dejected about this.
What's your take on that, Arthur? Do you think that the sanctions have hurt Russia enough to make it basically to make them think twice about anything they're doing?
No, not really. I mean, Bill Browder did say that it's been incremental. So the thing is, knocking a few dollars off the barrel price of a barrel of Russian crude, Brent of Urals Russian oil is good. You know, every few dollars helps. You're knocking a little bit more off their revenue stream, and as has been said, limiting the amount that they can spend on their war effort. But at the same time, it's never going to be enough on its own, the sanctions. It's been kind of up and down. For example, when the oil price cap was brought in first, it had an immediate impact on their revenues. They went down. Then they got the shadow fleet going, went up again. The current sanctions are sort of working again on the shadow fleet to an extent, but they're still selling oil. I mean, it has been said, of course, about if there would be secondary sanctions on, for example, India and China, and you just totally embargo Russian oil altogether. Well, of course, that would severely potentially limit their revenues. But who's to say they wouldn't find other ways of selling the oil? And also, there would be obvious knock-on risks for the global economy if you were to, ramp up your sort of economic conflict with China to that extent, and also India, I don't think, would react particularly well to secondary sanctions.
You say obvious because you're a business reporter, but what are those knock-on risks? Just
well,
for
I mean, for example, in the context of the trade conflict at the moment with Trump in the White House, I'm not sure that secondary sanctions, for example, I mean, what would the form of the secondary sanctions be? I've seen, for example, tariffs been mentioned as possible sanctions. So, for example, a country that buys Russian oil or sanctioned Russian oil would then, any of its other exports would face massive tariffs going to, for example, the US or perhaps the EU. So that would be then playing into the trade conflict that we have going on at the moment. There would also be just the risk of damaging relationships with, for example, partners at a time of already, a lot of geopolitical tensions. So I'm not saying it's the right step or the wrong step, but it's a big step to take. Secondary sanctions. It's not just a case of, let's just take the Russian oil off the market. There will be significant knock-on effects in terms of political relationships, also the price of energy. If you took Russian oil off the market altogether and you tried to stop India, full stop, importing any Russian oil, maybe it's going to hit the Kremlin, but it's guaranteed to also hit the pockets of Europeans and Americans. And we've seen how when those things happen, they can also have knock-on political consequences that are not always necessarily what you want to see.
This is probably the most basic question anyone could ask, but what is oil used for? What is Russian oil used for?
Well, Russian oil is used for everything from, fuel to run vehicles, aviation fuel to power the planes of the world, for cars, for anything that transports from, on the roads, on trains, and then powering homes, powering businesses. It's used to basically run the world, essentially. Russian oil is the same as any other oil. People will use the same oil to power a machine if it does the job, and it all does. So just because it's sanctioned doesn't limit its actual effectiveness as a fuel.
Okay. Just to come back with the idea of what's happening in the Baltic Sea, because we've now talked about sanctions, but I'm curious what's going to happen now with this what appears to be an escalation in the Baltic Sea, and I want to bring Terry back in here because I'd like your take on it. You've been reporting on NATO for a really long time. Is this the scary moment for them? We've seen, you're in the know, so you see the fighter jets flying all the time. But for an audience like us who don't see it that often, it does feel like an escalation. Is that your reading on this? Is there a danger here that things could get out of control if cool heads are not kept?
I'm going to disappoint you. I really don't think that.
Okay.
In fact, there aren't more. No, really, because these flights have been happening even before the beginning of the full-scale invasion. NATO jets were policing Baltic airspace actually since Crimea, because Russia was using this as a way to try to intimidate the smaller frontline NATO allies. So this is something that's, expensive, annoying, but it's run of the mill for NATO now that Russia will buzz their airspace, send jets in, regularly, I have to say. So this doesn't seem like an escalation in actually, daring NATO jets to take them on. But what again, the most interesting part about this incident that happened last week in Estonian waters is simply that Russia is claiming that tanker instead of pretending that these are, no, it really is the Marshall Islands ship. No, it's not. Everybody knows it's not. And some incredible research done by an NGO in Denmark called Danwatch, which actually is made up of journalists, has traced these tankers, for their entire journeys, and has been able to look at them, like Arthur mentioned earlier, look at them, turn around and take the, reprocessed oil back and resell it to Europe and things like this. Now, something interesting, there are a couple interesting things that the EU is talking about, because they're very aware of how ineffective it is to let so much money go into Russia's pocket when they could try to do more about it. So one interesting thing is that the oil is traceable. And so if you really wanted to get serious, and I guess this will tell us if they do, you could tell that this reprocessed oil came from this, these Russian tankers in the first place. So you could test it on its way in, and you could know that it's that oil on its way out. And there are people inside the EU who definitely want to take those kind of measures. The other thing they're talking about, and I think this was mentioned earlier, is lowering the oil price cap, because the price of oil is lower than it was when they put this into effect. And plenty of people then said, no way, that's $60 a barrel is allowing Russia to continue to make way too much legally. They want to lower it. And this week I even heard, that the hawks among them want to make it as low as $30 a barrel. So that would cut a lot of money out of Russia's war chest. I don't think you'll be able to get agreement on that. Remember that on sanctions, you have to get all member states to agree, and you've got Hungary in there, which is always a problem. But I certainly think they may be able to get agreement on lowering it from 60. And as Arthur said, every dollar counts. And so I think that that's something that we're going to see in future sanctions packages in not too long.
Okay.
But that's
sorry.
the EU, and you've got to get the G7 on board. And it's all right.
I was just going to.
There's just so many exceptions.
Yes, and I was just going to pick up, Terry, on something that Medieval Cookery in our chat has been talking about those sanctions. And you just said, an issue there being Hungary, but Medieval Cookery points out that currently the sanctions need to be approved at the highest level by all EU countries, and that means that it can take months and years to close holes, and therefore holes develop all the time, and they should. How come there isn't basically a quicker way of doing it? They actually suggest that there should be an office in the Commission that can create sanctions on the spot and have them pass through other mechanisms. And they suggest the ambassadors as a question. I mean, I know that there's a huge amount of process that goes through into all of this, and there's never going to be a quick fix. But it is a problem, isn't it, that things can take so long to actually see the light of day when it has to go through such a long process and get the buy-in of so many different states.
Well, you've still got a Hungarian ambassador sitting there. So they are approved at the ambassadorial level, but then they do have to go up to the ministerial level. They don't need to be approved by heads of state. For example, they need to go to a ministerial council. And I think that's considered high enough. So I may be wrong on that, exactly how high they have to go, but it can't be just at ambassadorial level. But anyway, Hungary's there anyway. If they want to block it, they can. I think, as we speak, I'm thinking as we talk about this, the answer really comes from member states themselves making the decision for moral reasons, if not economic reasons, that they're not going to buy this anymore. They will be required to phase it out by 2027, but that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money for weapons to be used against Ukraine away. And so I think that, unless you can count on countries making a decision because it's the right thing to do, that they will stop buying this, I don't know how you move it along faster.
Okay, Terry, thanks for your insights. I really appreciate you joining us from NATO headquarters in Brussels. DW correspondent Terry Schultz.
Big fun. Thank you.
Thanks
Terry.
a lot.
Bye.
I wanted to go to Dustin now because we had that poll up, and I want to see how many people participated and what people are saying. What's their opinion?
It's a wide poll. A lot of people have voted. I think we even had one vote. Let me just look it up. One person didn't even. Kind of took part of the poll, but not part of the question, and voted the UK out of the EU, even though that was not a question asked in the poll. So that was kind of
side poll.
And that's possibly
that's one special vote that we had. Otherwise, the question was: can Europe's efforts stop the shadow fleet? And answer number one was the EU is playing hardball now. 19% of our users think that. Then answer number 2 was yes, but sanctions would not be enough. That's the winner. 34% of the users think that's still the winner, but not super high percentage. And then 30% of the users think, no, the EU is all talk, and 17 think countries will always buy cheap oil.
Yeah. Okay, well. Thanks for everybody who participated in that, all the people who've been commenting on the show, giving us questions. I also want to thank Arthur Sullivan for joining us in the studio. Really fascinating, best description ever of sanctions. So we really appreciate that. And yeah, that's it from me.
And lots of people in the chat, thank you very much for all your comments. It does seem a lot of you are very suspicious of sanctions because effectively what you're saying is it's very clear they aren't working. So thank you very much for putting your comments in. Let's see what happens in the future over this. Just to say that next week, you can find out what we will be discussing about 24 hours before we go live with the stream on our community post, which is now being renamed as just
Posts.
The Post.
You'll find it on YouTube.
You'll find it on YouTube, and then we will decide what we're talking about. So really hope you can join us then. Thank you very much to everyone who has been talking. And hi, Carolina. Thank you for all your comments as well. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.